So good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depending where you are currently. Welcome back to a new series of the International Macrohistory online seminar. This series will run from today until May 17th, and the rules are the same as we've had in the past series. Presenters of each paper will have 40 minutes, followed by 20 minutes Q&A and an extra 15 minutes optional, also for continuing questions and answers. And today we start with a big impact topic, essentially try to understand the path of US debt to GDP over the last 7 decades. And in order to answer the question of did the US really grow out of its post-World War II debt, we have two speakers, Julien, Acalin, and Laurence, both from Johns Hopkins University. And as is become the tradition in this seminar series, we don't have long introductions. So on that note, I just pass the floor to Julien. Julien.
Thank you very much, Rui. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Either a good morning or a good afternoon, whether you're on this side of the Atlantic or the other side. Let me share my slides here. Up. So I hope you can see them well. Okay, I'll assume so. So thank you for joining, and many thanks to the organizers for having our paper in this online seminar. So today I'm really glad to present this joint work with Larry, who is also in the room today, on did the US really grow out of its World War II debt. So the reason why you were asking the question is that, as many of you may know, the debt to GDP ratio today in the US is pretty high. So here, what you see on this slide is the debt to GDP ratio for the US over the past 80 years or so. And so as you can see here at the very end of this series, this is the data point for 2021, the debt to GDP ratio was above 110% of GDP. Mostly the increase over the past 2 decades was due to primary deficits following the global financial crisis, and then most recently, the post-pandemic recovery. If you want to go back in time and see such a point where the debt to GDP ratio was as high as today, where you'll have to go back to World War II, basically, where the debt to GDP ratio was about 100% of GDP. So even though the picture may look scary in some sense, quite recently, people haven't been so scared in some sense following some few prominent economists such as Blanchard or Jason Furman, who argued that maybe the high debt to GDP ratio today is not too much of a concern going forward because R is less than G, as is commonly known by now. So Blanchard, during his presidential address, which was very influential, argued that because R, the interest rate that is paid on the debt, is lower on average than G, the growth rate of the economy, then naturally the debt to GDP ratio would decrease over time, and so we should not be too worried about the high level today. And so the big question is, can we repeat, the experience post-World War II, which was guiding this result regarding R minus G? So the view that a few prominent economists are taking, as I said, and here I'm quoting Krugman, and I'm putting some screenshots from Twitter from Krugman. Basically, he was arguing that America never repaid its war debt. And so he's arguing that as the economy kept growing after World War II, the debt became irrelevant as a share of GDP. And so basically, he's describing a growing out of debt effect, and he's saying that this is mostly what was at play during that time. Of course, because Krugman is careful as well, he's not saying foolishly that we can repeat that whatever going forward. He say that for that to repeat again, we would not have to run large deficits going forward, which is not what the CBO is projecting, by the way. So huge reserve here on what could happen going forward. However, our view here in this paper is going to be quite different. And the reason is that we will say that it's very draw to hard inferences from the experience that follow the World War II. And basically for two main reasons. The first one is that real interest rates were heavily distorted in the period that followed World War II for two reasons. The first and probably the main one is that the Fed was not independent during the period between 1942 up to 1951. So basically the role of the Fed was to refinance the debt issued by the Treasury and to provide cheap refinancing for the war effort. So during that period, nominal interest rates were pegged, and the nominal yield curve in some sense was totally controlled, running from 0.3% on Treasury bills to 2.5% nominally on long-term bonds. And so this is only after March 1951 and the Fed Treasury Accord that the Fed really became independent and started to have an independent monetary policy. So it was not the case before that. You would have assumed that keeping nominal rates below market rates and probably below what would be needed just to keep the economy on a stable path would be inflationary. But actually, we did not see inflation before 1947. The reason why is that there were price controls in the US during the war, which is again not the case today. And so these price controls were removed in 1947 and led to a large spike, as we will see, in inflation in 1947 and in the following years. Needless to say that inflation remained quite high even after that, in particular due to the Korean War and then later on in the 60s and 70s. The other main reason as to why the current situation is very different from the one after World War II is that after the war, the US government was running quite large primary surpluses. And so here, as you can see on this picture, I'm plotting primary surpluses as a share of GDP from 1947 up to 1974. And as you can see here, primary surpluses were quite large, at about 6% of GDP in 1948, as you know, war expenditures were not here anymore. So, and as you know, the economy was recovering as well. So government revenues were much higher than government expenditures. And that was the case on average over the period where the primary surplus was on average about 1% of GDP. So for the 20 years that followed the end of the war. And so for these two reasons, we tend to think that going forward, we tend to be a little bit more scary about the current high debt to GDP ratio. So what we want to do in this paper is to try to disentangle these different effects of first unexpected inflation, then the peg, and third primary surpluses on the path of the debt to GDP ratio after World War II. So here what we are going to do is to build a counterfactual analysis where we will estimate what the public debt to GDP would have been absent those three different effects. In order to do so, we are going to use granular information regarding debt securities. And so for each debt security that will be outstanding at every period in time, we will have information regarding its date of issuance, its maturity, and its yield. And we will use that information as well as measures of inflation expectation to build our counterfactual. The three main results that we are going to show in the paper is the first one, the public debt to GDP ratio would only have declined from 106% of GDP in 1946 to 70% only as a share of GDP instead of 23% in actual history in 1974. If primary balances had been equal to 0 over that period, and if there were no real interest rate distortion, either coming from surprise inflation or from the peg. If we want to decompose that effect, so the difference between our counterfactual estimate and actual history is this difference between 73% and 23%. So roughly about 50 percentage point of GDP. If we were to decompose this effect, then we do find that about 27 percentage points stems from real interest rate distortions, and about 17% stems from primary surpluses. There is also a combined effect, which is about 6 percentage points, which is a combined effect of real interest rate distortion and primary surpluses, because as you have lower primary surpluses, the debt to GDP ratio in our counterfactual is higher. And so the effects of real interest rate distortions also become higher in this case. But so roughly speaking, here in this effect, it's about 60% coming from real interest rate distortion and 40% from primary surpluses. Later, after we keep doing this counterfactual exercise after 1990, what we do find is that R star minus G is greater than 0. And by R star here, I mean the interest rate on the debts, on the government debts, which is non-distorted either by nominal frictions or by unexpected inflation. And so we do find in this scenario that still the undistorted interest rate paid on the debt on average was higher than the growth rate of the economy over the past 40 years. So which, it's a different view than saying that R was lower than G over the whole period. Okay, so this paper is related to two main literatures. The first one on the erosion of the public debt after World War II, and the other one about debt rollovers and R minus G. But for the sake of time here, let me skip this slide and let's move on to our conceptual framework here. So the framework that we are going to use is going to be the debt dynamics equation. And so here in the first equation, I'm showing you some equation that should be very familiar to you. So that's the debt dynamics equation, which states that the par value of the debt today is equal to 1 plus the interest rate paid on the par value of the debt outstanding in the last period, minus the primary surplus or the primary balance of the government. So here there are two things I want to highlight. The first one is that the time unit here is going to be the fiscal year throughout this presentation. So we do not use calendar years, but we do use fiscal years because most of the data that we use will be based using this time frame. And then I want to highlight the fact that we are using the par value of the debt here and not the market value of the debt, because this is the measure that is commonly used in policy discussions. And doing the same exercise with the market value of the debt would be slightly more tricky, but would lead to very similar results. So what we want to do in our counterfactual is the equation that you have here in equation 2, is to estimate the path of the public debt if whether primary balances here, P hat, were either equal to the ones in actual history or equal to 0 in one of our counterfactual. Or the other thing that we're going to do is to adjust here for the average interest rates paid on the debt. And so the adjustment here that we're going to make is going to be such as the real ex ante interest rate here on the debt is going to be undistorted. So we want to control, as I said before, for unexpected inflation and for distortions which are going to come from the peg and the fact that nominal interest rates were kept very low during the peg period. So it's going to be relatively straightforward to do the adjustment just for the primary balance. Basically, we're going to run this equation here and just imposing that P hat is going to be equal to 0. And then we are going to normalize our measures of debt in our counterfactual by GDP. I should mention that the GDP in our counterfactual will be equal to the GDP in actual history. So here we are not making any taking any stance on GDP, and we will assume for simplicity that it's the same in our counterfactuals as in actual history. However, it will be slightly more tricky to adjust for distortions here on the interest rates. And so this is what I want to show you on the next slide. I want really to show you precisely how we are going to correct for these interest rate distortions. And so for that, it would be useful just to introduce this notation here, this XT, which we are going to call the average effective interest rate adjustment, which is simply going to be the difference between IT hat in our counterfactual and IT in actual data. So in order to make that adjustment, what is going to matter is the fact, the small nuance that the debt that is outstanding at any point in time will be the sum of debts that was issued, in past periods. And so we want to know when the debt that is outstanding today was first issued. And so this is what we are going to call the reverse maturity structure of the debt. And so here the interest rate paid on the debt could be expressed as a weighted average on the interest rate paid at time t on debt that was issued at t minus 1 minus j, where j could be equal going from 0 to m, where t minus 1 minus m would be the time at which the first debt that is still outstanding today was first issued. So here the weights that we are going to apply to these different interest rates are going to be the ratio of the debt that is outstanding today and was issued t minus 1 minus j periods ago as a share of the debt that is outstanding today. And so this ratio here is what we call the weight. So it's going to be here w t minus 1j. And this whole structure of W's is going to be what we call the reverse maturity structure of the debt, as opposed to the traditional maturity structure of the debt, which is a forward-looking object. Here in our counterfactual, we are going to assume that this reverse maturity structure stays the same in our counterfactual as in actual history. This is a small approximation we're making here, but we do think it's a good first approximation to get our counterfactual. And the nice thing about it is once you make this assumption, then you can express the IT hat, so the undistorted interest rates on the debt, as the sum of the actual interest rate on the debt plus this weighted adjustment that we're going to apply on different parts of the debt. So here, as you can see, this xtj plus 1 is going to be the adjustment that we're going to make on the debt that is paying interest at time t and that was issued some time ago. Why will that matter for us that we do make that distinction? For two things. First, because we will distinguish about whether the debt was issued under the peg, that means between 1942 and 41, or whether it was issued after that. And also, even if it was, depending on when it was issued, will matter because expectations of inflation will vary over time. So depending on when you issue your debt will have an importance because what people thought inflation would be over the next 2, 5, 10, etc. years would matter on when the debt was issued. So let me walk you through this XT adjustment that we're making. And here the adjustment, as I said, will depend on the time the debt was issued. So let me explain to you this equation 6 by going in reverse chronological order. So here for all the debt that was issued after 1952, that means after the Fed Treasury Accord, we are going to simply correct for a distortion between inflation and what people thought inflation would be when the bond was issued. And so this way we make sure that ex post real interest rates are equal to ex ante real interest rates and that there are no distortions coming from unexpected inflation. For the debt that was issued during the PEG, it's slightly more tricky because we have two effects here. We want to make sure that ex post real interest rates are equal to ex ante real interest rates, but we know that ex ante real interest rates were not market interest rates back then. So here we have to make an adjustment. So we are going to take the difference between our estimates, our own estimates of what real ex ante undistorted interest rates would have been during the PEG, minus what real ex post interest rates have been. And so for that, we need to make here an assumption about what these undistorted real interest rates RT star were during the PEG. And so for that, what we are going to do is to estimate a term structure for debt issues over the 10 years that are going to follow the PEG. So for the years over 1951 up to 1961. And here we are going to use market data and inflation expectation to have a term structure of real ex ante interest rates on the debt over that period. And we are going to assume that the debt that was issued during the PEG period would follow that term structure of real interest rates that was in place in the 10 years that followed. So the yield curve that we get for that period is about 1.4 1.4% at 1 year, about 2% at 5 years, and then 2.5% at a 10-year horizon. And so these are the estimates that we are going to use here for our R-star. There are two other things that I should mention here, two small complications that would arise for the debt that was issued after 1952. The first one is that we are not going to adjust treasury bills. So here we are going to take a conservative view, and we are going to assume that you cannot erode the value of the debt if that debt takes the form of treasury bills, which are usually rolled over a period of 90 days. So if there is some surprise inflation here, we are going to assume that interest rates will adjust, and so we will not adjust treasury bills. And to give you a rough sense of the quantitative sense here, treasury bills, on average, they represent about 20% of the debt that is outstanding at any point in time. So that means we are not going to adjust for that 20% of the debt. And the second point is that after 1997, the Treasury started to issue tips. And so, of course, these tips already adjust for inflation. So we will take that into account and not include them twice in our adjustment. Great. So now let me show you. So I should have had mentioned that one key variable that we need to get still are those expectations here. So these are the term structure of inflation expectation for any point in time. And so this is one object that we'll need to get, and I'll show you on a couple of slides how we obtain these estimates here for the term structure of inflation expectation. So let's turn to our variables. First, I want to talk a little bit about the data sources here because it will be important. So on the fiscal side, we are going to use data mostly from Hall, Payne, and Sargent, which built an impressive database going back in time with information regarding quantities and description of all securities that were issued by the Treasury before 1960. And so we are going to use that database for our fiscal data up to 1960. Then for the period after 1960, we're going to use the CRISP database, which provides quantities and description of marketable securities, excluding treasury bills. So it will not be a problem for us that this second database is going to exclude treasury bills because we are not going to make any adjustment on them anyway throughout the period. But because it doesn't have non-marketable securities after 1960, we have to make some assumption here regarding the reverse maturity structure of the non-marketable debt after 1960. And here we are just simply going to assume that the reverse maturity structure of the non-marketable debt is going to remain unchanged after 1960. We don't think that this is a crucial assumption, mostly because the share of non-marketable debt as a share of total debt became quite irrelevant over time. We are going to use data from OMB and MSPD regarding the primary balances and GDP here on the fiscal side. And then we also have a set of data on the inflation side, and mostly we care about inflation expectation. And so for that, we are going to use two measures of inflation expectation. One is going to be short-term, and the other one is going to be long-term. So for the short-term expectation after 1969, we are going to use the Survey of Professional Forecasters, which provides us directly with GDP deflator expectations. And so this is the measure that we want because the GDP deflator is the relevant measure when we do our counterfactual for the debt to GDP ratio. So for the period after 1969, we use the SPF. For the period before that, we are going to use Livingston data, but these data are on the CPI. So here we are just going to assume that the expectation error on the CPI is the same as the expectation error on the GDP deflator. And so using that assumption, we will be able to recover inflation expectation for the GDP deflator for the period going from 1951 up to 1969. And I can show you later in the questions that this assumption, has strong support in the data for the period for which we have the two data sets overlap. For the long-term expectations, we are going to use data from the Fed, from the FRB US model. And here, these data are mostly coming from surveys like the SPF and from the Fed own estimates for the periods for which we do not have survey data. So these data only go back to 1968, and we still need data at least starting from 1951, the period after the PEG. And so for that, we are going to produce our own estimates, and we find that the behavior of long-term inflation expectation is well explained by the level of a smoothed version of the short-term expectation, as well as the change in the smoothed version of the short-term expectation. And so here I have a regression which shows this statistical impact, but I will show you how it looks like in the data. I think it will be easier to see it this way. But so this way, we are able to build inflation expectation both short-term and long-term, going back to 1951. And we will use that to build a term structure of our inflation expectation for all these years. Okay, now I will describe a few of the variables that will be in the background of our counterfactuals. The first one is going to be what we call the reverse maturity structure of the debt. So the weights, the W's here, the different weights. So here what you see for any given point in time, you have the share of the debt. This is, let's say here, the dark shaded area that was issued during that year. And then as you move up, you will have the share of the debt that was issued a year ago, 2 to 5 years ago, and then more than 5 years ago. As you may see from this chart here, the reverse maturity structure of the debt was really short right after the end of the war. And that's precisely because a lot of the debt was issued quite recently, right? In 1946 and even still in 1947. Then you had this slow decline in the average reverse maturity structure of the debt, and then it started to decrease slightly over time. But what I want to say here is that, as you may see, on average, about 30% of the debt that is outstanding at any point in time was issued in that year. And so out of that, we are going to take the 20%, which are about 20%, which are treasury bills, and this will not be adjusted in our data, as we want to be quite conservative here. So the adjustment will mostly play on debt that was issued quite a long time ago. Okay, because we want to understand how unexpected inflation will play a role here, I show you on the blue line the actual inflation data for any point t, as well as what market investors were expecting a year ago that inflation would be in that given year, and what they were expecting 10 years ago that inflation would be in that year. And so these short-term and long-term inflation expectations are the ones that you see here in dotted lines. As is obvious from this chart, inflation was running high and well above what people thought it would be, at least up to 1980. So here you have the fact that inflation surprises were positive in that case for the whole period up to 1980, where inflation was consistently above the 1-year inflation expectation and the inflation expectation that was formed 10 years ago. Then the situation reversed after 1980. So that's sort of a regime change here after Volcker, increased interest rates in the US. And so what you see is that after that period, inflation surprises will actually go the other way. They would tend to push up the real value of the debt to GDP ratio, because inflation was actually most of the time lower than what people thought it would be. Next, I want to show you our short-term and long-term inflation expectation that we are going to use to derive our term structure of inflation expectation. And so here, these are the data which are coming from different surveys, as I explained before. And as you may notice, so here, pre-1968, for the long-term expectation, this is our own estimate that we get by having that regression of long-term inflation expectation on short-term inflation expectation. So these are mostly survey data, except for this part here that will be useful to us, but that comes from our own regression estimate. So once we have something I was not maybe clear about, but here the long-term inflation expectation is the average inflation expectation over the next 10 years. So here we have two inflation expectations. We have the short term, which is a 1 year ahead inflation expectation, and we have the average expected inflation over the next 10 years. So we are going to use these two informations, and we are going to make an assumption regarding the shape of the term structure of inflation expectation to derive them. So here, let me show you how our term structure of inflation expectation look like. So to get these, the assumption that we are going to make is that the adjustment for inflation, or the path for inflation expectation, is going to be linear from T+1 to T+5. So these inflation expectations are going to adjust linearly and then remain flat for the years going from T+5 to T+6 up to T+10. We're going to use this assumption combined with the fact that on average, we still want to make sure that these inflation expectations going forward are going to match the long-term data that we do have to recover this full path of inflation expectation over 10 years. And so this is how we got our term structure, and what we could see, well, it was, of course, increasing during the period running up to the 80s, and then it was decreasing after that. An interesting fact is that the term structure of inflation expectation is quite flat in the US, after the 2000, meaning that whether you market participants, pretty much believe that the Fed commitment that inflation would be averaging 2% in the short run and also in the medium run. So the way we are going to build our inflation surprises will be by taking the difference between realized inflation and these inflation expectations formed at different period back in time. All right, now that I have introduced all the different variables that are going to be used in our counterfactuals, let me now show you the results here, the key results of the paper. So the main one is going to be the difference between the actual average interest rate paid on the debt and our own estimate of the counterfactual interest rate on this debt. So here the blue line is the actual average interest rate on the debt, and this one is computed just by dividing the total interest rate payment at time t divided by the stock of debt at t-1. And here, more interestingly, you see our counterfactual IT hat, which is our measure for undistorted interest rates on the debt. As you can see here, in the period that followed the war, the two of them diverge quite a lot. So here, the adjustment that we make for 1947 is about 12%. That would be the difference between the 15 here and the 3%. And the adjustment is still high in 1951. In these two, for these 2 years, inflation was extremely high. So this is, the fact that nominal interest rates were kept below market interest rate here during that period, plus the fact that inflation was running above 20% in 1947 after the removal of price controls in the US. You still have this peak here during the Korean War, which led to a lot of inflation as well in the US. And here you see that this difference is going to remain relatively small and then start to pick up again in the 60s and back in the 70s. And after that, after the 80s, as I told you, the adjustment is going to play the other way, because inflation was running below what people thought it would be. And so this is why here our IT hat is going to be below the actual IT. So once you plug this IT hat into our debt dynamics equation, how does it look like? So this is what you'll see on the next chart. So here, this is the chief result of the paper. So let me go carefully through it. The blue line is going to be the actual debt to GDP ratio. That's the one that you saw at the very beginning of this presentation. We are going to assume here, and maybe I did not mention that in our counterfactuals, we are going to start from the same debt to GDP ratio in 1946, where the debt to GDP ratio reached its peak, and then we are going to play with our debt dynamics equation. So here what you see, this dotted line, is what would have happened if primary surpluses were kept equal to 0. So here the decrease in the debt to GDP ratio is still present here, meaning that R minus G, ex post R minus G was indeed negative and was driving down this debt to GDP ratio. And then you see that it started to diverge and slightly increase after 1980. Here, what you see with the dashed line is what would happen if you just do the adjustment on the interest rate, but keep primary balances as in actual history. And again, the message is about the same, that the debt to GDP ratio would have declined, but still the decline is less pronounced than in actual history. If you have a look at the combined effects, that is going to be the red line, where we are going to adjust both for primary balances, and we're going to keep them equal to 0, and we are going to adjust for distortions on the real interest rates. This is what you obtain. And here, you know, the story is slightly different from the one that you can infer from looking at the blue line. So if you have a look at 1974, which is where the debt to GDP ratio reached its trough at 23% in actual history, we do find that in this combined counterfactual, the ratio was about 73%. So that's 50 percentage point difference I was talking about at the beginning of the presentation. What you do find, so that's actually quite a strong difference compared to what we see in actual data. Then if you continue, you know, this counterfactual exercise and you continue up to here, the latest point is going to be 2021. What you see is what I explained before. Let's first start with the primary balance counterfactual, because this one will shut down the primary balance. So we'll just leave us with the impact of ex post R minus G on the debt. And so here, as you see, the ratio was increasing starting from 1980, suggesting that ex post R minus G on the debt was positive, not negative. Then remember that I told you the adjustment that we are going to make on the distortion for the interest rate was going the other way after 1980, precisely because inflation was lower than expected. So let's see how it would look like for our undistorted R minus G. And this is the effect that you would see here on the red line after 1980. So again, we're correcting for primary balances, and we have the undistorted interest rate minus G here, which is going to drive this ratio. And as you can see, again, the ratio is increasing. So the slope is not the same because R undistorted R here is going to be lower than the ex post R, but still, you know, the slope, is going to be, it's going to be lower. So, but still the slope is positive here, meaning that the undistorted R minus G was still positive after 1980. If you have a look at the picture overall, you know, the true growing out of debt effect running from 1946 to 2021 was about 15 percentage point of GDP. So here the debt to GDP ratio in our total counterfactual is about 91% of GDP as compared to 106% of GDP here. So it's a reduction of only 15 percentage point here. The very last point I want to make, I think I still have a couple of minutes, is, well, our result here seemed to differ greatly from what Blanchard was showing in his very influential presidential address. So here, let me show you how our counterfactual look like. So here it's going to be the yellow line, which is our total counterfactual, compared to the ones that Blanchard showed in his presidential address. And here, the reason why the two of them differ really come from the way we measure interest rates. And so the main thing is going to be that we use the average interest rate on the debt. And as I told you during that presentation, this is a weighted average of past interest rates. So in some sense, our measure of the interest rate is going to have a lot of inertia here. While Blanchard is going to use market interest rate on the 1-year and 10-year rates. And these are market interest rates. And because interest rates were trending down, starting from 1980, the interest rates in Blanchard analysis is going to be much lower than ours, because ours is going to be still, again, this weighted average of past interest rates. So this is the difference between our line here and this blue line. And then he's making an additional adjustment, which is to take into account what he calls a tax adjustment. But here I'm happy to talk about that as well in the questions, but we think there are good reasons to think that there are other factors that will go the other way. For example, that by issuing more debt, you're crowing out capital. And so you're not getting some revenues that you would have had by taxing capital, which is not existing in that counterfactual. So we do think that the two forces pretty much balance in this case. And so what really matters here would be the difference between our scenario here and this scenario in the blue line. And so the main difference, as I said, is that we use average interest rate on the debt. And we do think that for our purposes, because we're looking at the evolution of the debt to GDP ratio and the par value of the debt to GDP ratio, we think it's the right measure to use. Let me conclude here. So here in this paper, we try to answer the question as to whether the US really grow out naturally out of its World War II debt. And in order to answer that question, we provide a counterfactual where the primary balance could either be equal to the same as in actual data or equal to 0, and where we are going to control for distortions, real distortions that were arising on public debt. And so once you do the proper adjustment, we do find in our counterfactual that the decline in the debt to GDP ratio would have been much less pronounced that we do observe in the data. So instead of seeing this decline from 106% of GDP in 1946 to 23% in 1974, we only find a decline up to 73% in 1974. If we were to extend this analysis up to 2021, we find that the total effect of going out of debt was only about 15 percentage points of GDP, in the sense that the debt in our counterfactual in 2021 is about 90% of GDP. So put differently, we barely find an effect of growing out of debt over this whole 80 years period. So our message here would be a bit, careful about the public debt going forward, and we tend to think that history should not make us too optimistic about the prospect of growing out of debt. Thank you very much for listening, and happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for keeping to the timings and for a super interesting presentation. There's a lot to unpack in your paper. So, sorry, something happening here. Computer. I'm sorry, can you see me?
Yes.
Sorry, my computer decided to
no problem.
Crash unexpectedly according to Zoom. All right, so to the public, just to quickly remind you, if you have questions, you are very welcome to type them in the Q&A or raise your electronic hands, and then I'll just try to feed them to the presenters as they come. So there's already one question in the Q&A, and I think I know the answer because I read it in your paper. Jian Wang asks whether you used the actual historical GDP series, and if so, should we take the results, your counterfactual results, as a lower bound, since you're not taking into consideration the effect of an undistorted interest rate on the GDP even further? But maybe you can answer that quickly.
Yes, absolutely. So we take, so short answer is yes. So we do take in our counterfactual the same GDP data as in actual history. And indeed, we tend to make quite conservative assumptions here in the paper just to make sure that the effect that we get is a lower bound on the total effect that we could get. You could also think, for example, that in the counterfactual exercise, the debt to GDP is higher than in actual history. So this could have led also to higher interest rates, for example, in which way, this would further drive up the counterfactual debt to GDP ratio. But we're not making that assumption here. So in some sense, yes, we're trying to be quite conservative.
And also to the extent debt crowds out capital, GDP in the denominator could be lower.
Yeah,
exactly.
Absolutely. Good. Well, questions are coming fast. So Subadip Halder asks, why are you assuming that the maturity structure of the debt is invariant in your counterfactual exercise? And of course, he's citing the very well-known result by Howell and Sargent. There's also a companion paper by Martin Ellison for the UK. Both of them argue that, you know, the debt management offices might have done a much better service, right, and could have actually reduced the debt burden by focusing on short-term debt. What do you have to say about that?
So probably, so here, you know, you would have to make assumptions as to what the maturity structure. So, okay, let me take an example. So our counterfactual debt to GDP ratio is going to differ from the actual debt to GDP ratio. So that means that the Office of the Management of the Debt would have had to issue more debt during those years. And then the question is, what would have been the maturity of the debt that they would have had issued during those years? One assumption we could have made is to assume that the maturity structure of the debt they would have had to issue would have been the same as the one they actually issued. And then we could have recovered the reverse maturity structure of the debts by iteration. So it's slightly more involved, I think, and we tend to think that the first approximation, that just assuming that the reverse maturity structure is unchanged, is a good one. But we leave that for further research, I think, that extension here. And I don't know if, Larry, you want to
Yeah, no, I mean, the short answer is just to keep the calculations from getting too complicated, but that's certainly a direction that this could be pushed in the future.
Yep.
Our guess is it doesn't make a huge difference, but it could certainly be investigated.
Yeah. Okay. Miley Zavaro from UPenn asks, what's the frequency at which you have your inflation expectation series, and how would it align with the very technical and wonkish point that the civil year doesn't fit with the fiscal year? So can you tell us how you adjusted that?
So what we have, so the data, I think, are quarterly for most of the period, after 1968, and they tend to be semi-annual before that. But at the end, so in the way we compute data, we are extremely careful, actually, about the way that we cover fiscal years. So we are extremely careful about it, just to cover inflation expectation over the calendar year, while we would have just the fiscal year instead. So short answer is, I didn't want to bother you with those details, but we are extremely careful about it. And I'm happy to follow up after the presentation if
Melis is interested, we can continue with
absolutely
discussion. Yeah, we're all enthusiasts here, so you need not apologize. So while we get more questions, again, there's a raised hand, and who raised the hand?
Nathan.
Nathan. Okay, Nathan, you can unmute yourself and ask your question directly.
Hi, Julien, Larry. Great paper. Following the question on the GDP, so a lot of these ceteris paribus assumptions when you're calculating could be quite sensitive. There's even the inflation expectations are probably conditional on the interest rate policy not pursued by the Fed. So had the Fed not repressed interest rates, maybe inflation wouldn't have developed as it would. Maybe so So how do you? So is one counterfactual as if interest rates were free, but then determined also by the inflation expectations. The nominal interest rate was and the real, but had the Fed not repressed interest rates, maybe inflation again would have developed differently. And GDP already answered in part in your paper, but the main variable is inflation expectations, but also to what extent the primary deficit is conditional on the development of GDP, given the fact that, say, if interest rates were too low, GDP was expanding much faster, that could have, again, interacted with a primary deficit. So there are a lot of moving parts here, and they're all kind of somehow related. So have you tried some kind of a more general equilibrium type of analysis to this?
Thanks for your
we have not. We have the idea that most of the general equilibrium effects would go in the direction of strengthening our results. That that if the debt had been higher, that would have led to higher interest rates, and lower growth. I was going to give sort of a technical answer about actually inflation expectations under the PEG are not, we don't use any assumptions about that. Well, we could talk about that technical point, but I think in general, I think we try to be conservative. Just if I could mention one other thing, Reinhardt and Sprencia, if I'm pronouncing the name right, they talk about various kinds of financial repression, regulation Q and different kinds of things. We look at what we think is the most important possibly, which is the pre-accord PEG. We don't really know how to quantify the other things. But again, I think, if we wanted to try to run up the size of the increase, there are other factors we could put in or that future research might consider.
Yeah, precisely on that point, right? So you perhaps justifiable, you're a closed economy analysis here, right? But we cannot forget, not necessarily other forms of, domestic financial repression, but we shouldn't forget a very stringent international setting of capital controls, the absence of any, alternative long-term remunerative government bonds outside of the US, right? So even without the PEG, right, it's almost like a captive market was created, right? For especially with treasury bonds more than is. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, Reinhardt and Sprencia talk about that. Yeah.
Right. So in a sense, you zoom on exclusively on what you think you can, write a reasonable counterfactual, which is this PEG, right, which was explicit and then abolished and so on, and that's all very fine, right? But it may be that you're over-interpreting it, right? Because the PEG was also in a broader context that actually lasted past the end of the PEG, right? These capital controls didn't go away, right? Then of course when the euro-dollar market comes in, things become more interesting and complicated, right? But so attributing it all to this relatively short period, right? Which I know, it's a nice way of selling your paper, right?
We calculate the effects of that one particular distortion, the PEG, and I arguably we calculate that in a reasonable way. I think if you also accounted for the things you're talking about, that would add on additional distortions, and our counterfactuals would have even higher debt GDP ratios.
Right. So because exactly your counterfactual interest rate would have to be higher, right?
Yeah, it would be even higher.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so the short answer is that we are assuming that there are no distortions on nominal interest rates after the Treasury Accord. So here, and I think that this is still, quite conservative. We're saying that after 1951, the nominal interest rates that you do observe are market interest rates. And as you were suggesting, there are good reasons to think they were not.
Yeah.
So here again, we tend to be a bit conservative.
Good. And in terms of the historical significance of your results, right? So you emphasize the difference between the blue curve and the orange curve, to put it in those terms, right? But does it really make sense to assume that the US government would keep an even keel with its zero primary surpluses throughout the time, right? It doesn't really make much sense when macroeconomic policy was becoming more active all the time. Right. And also the fact, and which I thought was appreciated by, call it the literature consensus, that actually two of the main contributors to the reduction of the post-war US debt were inflation and precisely interest rate compression. Right. I'm no longer updated with the literature, but I don't remember anyone claiming that it was growth. Right. That the US grew out of World War II debt, right? Inflation, I think, has been appreciated as a very important element, and of course, as Nathan was arguing, right, the post-war inflation level is related to the end of the price controls, but it's also related to this unreasonable accommodation from the Fed, right? These non-market interest rates, right? So maybe it would make more sense, to me at least, right, that you would focus your contribution on the difference between the top line and the other line, the dashed line, where you exclude the interest rate distortion, because that's, to me at least, that's really something new, right? Saying that inflation or primary surpluses, right, in the 40s and the 50s didn't matter. I think we already knew they did.
Yeah, if I understand the question correctly, I think we should be careful at how we motivate the paper. I think all of these effects have been discussed. I think Paul and Sargent talk about primary surpluses. Reinhardt and co-authors talk about surprise inflation and financial repression. We're basically just, I think our contribution is to try to quantify these things, using more detailed data, in a more elaborate methodology than has been done before.
And that's all very welcome, right? But your concluding slide, right? It's not true that the US could have grown out of its debt, right?
Actually, so I'm actually interested. I think we're interested in feedback about that. I mean, my sense is, although researchers have pointed out other things, I think, for example, the Paul Krugman quotes at the beginning, and we have a couple. I mean, I think that is an attitude people have that. I think that is kind of a common view. But I'm interested. I don't think it's just a straw man, but.
Okay. Very good. Again, for the audience, if you have other questions, please feed them here. Oh, and there's two new questions. So Subhadeep again asks you what you've assumed. So you're assuming that the holding period of bonds by the public, according to your reverse maturity assumption, is the same as in actual fact. And does this mean that you assume that the Treasury pays back the complete debt every period so as to keep the maturity buckets undisturbed in the hand of the public, right? So does your counterfactual actually, yeah, that's what you do.
Exactly.
That's what I understood.
Yeah, you understood very well. Yeah, this is what we're doing here.
Fantastic. All right, Eugene White has a question as well, and I'll read it. For experiences, you said that all interest rates were market rates. For banks and savings and loans, for most of this period, there were interest rate controls of deposits. When inflation caused a massive disintermediation, Congress, to keep deposits in the banks, raised the minimum denomination for Treasury bills from $1,000 to $10,000. I think this is a comment asking for a reaction.
Larry, if
I understand that correctly, again, that's I think pointing out that there were other types of financial repression, which we do not account for. Yeah. And I think to the extent that's a very valid point, and to the extent it's quantitatively important, it would make our results even more pessimistic about what would have happened with truly free interest rates. If I understand.
Yeah. I don't know if I interpreted your question correctly, Eugene. If you want, we can unmute you, and you can come back to your observation. But I do have one more suggestion, or rather a question, right? So you know that there was an active offshore market, or maybe you don't. There was an active offshore market in Zurich, right, throughout the war and in the early periods. Do you think you could use the yields of US bonds quoted in Zurich as an alternative undisturbed interest rate?
That's a very good point. I was not aware of that. So, no, thank you for the suggestion. So you're saying the US was issuing some bonds offshore through Zurich during that period?
No. This is before the euro-dollar market. There was an offshore unregulated, offshore as it were, market in Zurich for all types of government bonds, right? And it's actually ways of getting information on the yields on those bonds, right? That's a suggestion. So there's a raised hand from Eugene, but as I mentioned earlier, to my embarrassment, I cannot control my Zoom account very well today. So Nathan or Mark, can you please unmute Eugene? There you are. Eugene, you can unmute yourself. Again, I can't unmute him. Can anyone do it? Sorry, this is the embarrassment of the first day. So things will get regular from next time. There you are, Eugene. Go ahead. Okay, so Eugene is unmuted here, but I don't hear his voice. But anyway, we've reached Eugene. I'll let you talk.
I just want to say, yes,
It's another distortion, and I don't think it's a minor one because it was part of the demise of the S&Ls and the collapse of a good portion of the financial industry. But as you said, that would push your results in one direction. So it might be nice to note some of those. Lots of very clever ways to repress the system. Sure. Nice paper.
Yeah. Fantastic. So I was about to stop the formal part of today's seminar. So we ended on the hour. And so thanks again, everyone. The WWII people return to the seminar, and we hope you keep on returning. Those who join us for the first time, please come back. And also to announce that we will reconvene again in 2 weeks' time on the 22nd of February to hear a paper on expert-led decay, the trade channel in the gold standard era, presented by Bernardo Candia and Matteo Pedemont. Until then, those who don't want to hang out for the extra 50 minutes of question and answers, thank you very much for joining us today, and we hope to see you next time. All right.
Thank you, everyone.
But this doesn't stop us, so we still have a few more minutes to squeeze something more from the speakers. So I asked you about the capital controls, the offshore rates. So your the very basic formula, right? The dynamic budget equation is missing one element, which are in IMF speak, it's called the stock flow adjustment, right? All the below the line adjustments that once in a while governments do. I don't know how important this was in this period for the US, right? Of course, the US never issued debt in foreign currencies, probably didn't do underhand conversions. But once in a while things can happen the other way around, right? So can you give us an idea of whether you thought about this and whether this
Sure.
affect your results? Go ahead.
Yes. So we did think about it, and actually, so I did not show it on the slide, not to complicate the slide, but actually it's there in the data. It's there in the counterfactual that you do.
That's my actually Julian's slides. There was a plus epsilon on the slide.
That's what it was.
Let's just, nobody will notice that. Let's just cut that out. But I mean, I believe the basic answer. Yeah, there are all sorts of weird accounting things. I think they're not that big, but we basically assume that term would have been the same in the counterfactual as in, or to put it differently, if we measure debt and interest rates and primary surpluses, our equation does not hold exactly the one that we showed. There's a residual, and we just hold that constant.
Yep.
Yeah.
And the residual is relatively small. So we have, I think, a picture in the paper that shows it. It's quite small. It's very small.
Okay, because for the earlier periods,
it does matter.
It wasn't that small, but
it does matter at the very beginning. But so we are just assuming it stays constant in the counterfactual.
Okay, so that I don't remember exactly why it was important in the 1950s, but it could have been things like debt conversions, right, to lower yields and so on, right? And if you didn't have a massaged market, you wouldn't be able to do as easy, right? So your assumption that these adjustments are orthogonal to your simulations might not necessarily be warranted. But I should have done my homework and check what exactly was behind this, and I'm sure you guys know it much better. But like I said, you don't need to apologize for anything. So we're all interested in this stuff.
Oh, that's great feedback.
Yeah, as detailed as you want.
No, that's good. That's good. We try
We've done this.
to hide
Yeah.
a few details, but
No.
yeah, thanks for bringing that.
Not necessary. Good. All right. On that note, the enthusiasts. Any more questions?
I mean, this is not jumping in here. It's not related to what you did, but maybe do you have a comparison? I mean, again, not the U.S. obviously, but some comparison where you didn't have these repressed rates and some kind of, again, it's not a counterfactual. It's not, but just a kind of a comparison group of countries. So a lot of the comments that we had about the financial the capital controls, all these things were global, obviously, but maybe other governments pursued maybe different strategies in terms of the interest rate, and they all had price controls. They all lifted them. So a lot of things are common. They all had huge debts, and but maybe other countries differed in terms of their monetary policy, and that could provide a little bit of some external motivation to this exercise. I mean, it's not a comment on the paper itself, but maybe just placing it in a wider context of these things.
Yeah, sure. So I think there is evidence in Reinhardt and Sbrencia about financial repression in different countries, and I think they try to have a list of what form these financial repressions would look like. That's also a project I started with Sbrencia some time ago to try to document systematically the financial repression in advanced economies after World War II. So this is still an ongoing project, but yes, indeed, there were like some commonalities, strong commonality, I would say, across countries, especially during that period up to 1980 and the financial liberalization, but you have still differences across countries. For example, I don't know, like in France, my home country, there were some sort of arrangement with the central bank, which was controlling directly the lending and the borrowing rates. So I know this, for example, was different. This was different. I think Monet has some work on that in the case of France.
And speaking of French, Pierre Sixic has a question. So he quotes Eric Hilt, telling us that in the 1920s, Truman was upset because of nominal loss as inflation went up. When were some people upset by real losses in the 1950s in the US? What was the political economy there?
I'm sorry, can you just repeat that, please?
So is essentially asking whether there was a political pushback against nominal losses because of the peg, the interest rate peg. What was the political economy in the US? It's a clarification question, I suppose.
That's a good question. To be honest, I don't know. So part of that was, motivated by saying this is a way to refinance the war effort. So I guess, this is just a way to appeal to citizens by saying, you should do it for your country. So I don't know. That's a good question. Maybe I should be looking for more historical evidence.
Yeah, we should know more. Yeah, certainly.
People were upset,
I think it's during the war and they're running up the debt. It was you were doing your patriotic duty, helping to win the war by buying war bonds. If I could sort of ask, I'm actually interested in feedback, as I said, about the motivation and sort of how. I mean, I have the sense that a lot of people have the story in their mind of, we grew out of our debt. There was no cost, and so we could grow out of the debt again. To what? I mean, is it right to sort of view that as a common viewpoint, or is it sort of, or how well known are the basic, points about financial repression and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I think I started that one, right? I've been actually also working a little bit on this, right? And with Barry I can agree. And in reading the literature, we thought that it was more or less non-contentious that inflation was the prime mover, not growth, both in the US and in Europe in the first decade, right? Once you get into the golden years, that's a different talk. And actually, most of the adjustment on these death ratios happens in the 50s, right?
Yeah.
So just one follow-up question on this.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of what you were saying, but I guess you were saying most of the adjustment is coming from inflation for the debt to GDP ratio in the 50s, but we should be concerned about the difference, like the unexpected inflation part, right? So it's really So I guess the contribution of the paper, so maybe we should not say it was mostly growth, but say we want to disentangle the effect between inflation and expected inflation. So we just have the unexpected inflation part. And we want also to provide some first assessment, quantitative assessment of how the peg compressed or distorted real interest rates during the period up to 1951. So maybe that would be one way to sell it.
Yeah, but to Nathan's point, right? Why don't you compare yourself to another country that got out of the war with this, similar debt mountain, and somehow resisted the temptation, right? Either to inflate it away or to tamper with the market for government bonds. And honestly, I don't think there is such a comparator.
Yeah, it's hard to think of.
Intervention in France was even
is.
more heavy-handed than in the US, right? But it's a nice idea, but I don't think there is one out there, or even a synthetic control that you can build. I don't think there is.
I mean, the other thing with the GDP and inflation is obviously that when you're doing debt to GDP, these are all nominal versus nominal, and part of the inflation goes into the nominal GDP, and that's in these debt to GDP ratios. So when you're saying it's inflation, you're saying growth, it's real growth or nominal growth. Right. Or for the debt, you care about nominal growth, obviously, and so again, there's some imprecision in this.
Yes.
Even in the stylized fact of growth, is it nominal growth and it's partly driven by inflation? Is it real growth? And that's again, I mean, some kind of a clarification or something nuance of that you should maybe.
That's a good point. In talking about inflation, so we build a lot on Hall and Sargent, which is wonderful research. But one way they portray their results, which I think is not especially helpful, they sort of calculate the increase from nominal interest payments and then the decrease from inflation. In economic terms, it makes more sense to net out, expected inflation and nominal interest rates and focus in on unexpected inflation.
Yeah, except that as you yourself mentioned, right? So there's a lot of inertia, right? In the interest burden of your debt, right? And you focus, I understand why, because you want to do the counterfactual on the reverse maturity, but let's call it the forward maturity matters a lot, right? So the US was in the favorable position of being able to issue relatively long dated bonds. Even during the period of the maximum peak of debt, which many other nations weren't exactly in a similar position, right? So that matters. That creates precisely that inertia, right? So, but it doesn't detract from what you've done, right? So because you wanted to do the counterfactual ex post, right? So, if you were going to do a out of sample prediction or something like that, have to do the other way around. Yeah. Anyway, this is super exciting, I have to say. So thank you so much for bringing the paper. It's great to see you. We look forward to future versions once you've worked out the pitch that you want to make. In any case, the results are really very interesting, and we hope you enjoyed the experience, and you come back to the seminar with other papers or as discussants. So
sure.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. So it almost makes me think Zoom might be a useful thing for the world.
There you are. A silver lining.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for hanging out.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone who hang out. Bye then.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.